Good afternoon, everybody. I always hate it when I am in the middle of conversation and I get interrupted by whoever's on stage. So my apologies for your networking conversations being interrupted, but you did attend a conference. So I am Richard Togley. I am the president and CEO of the Denver Public Schools Foundation, and honored and proud to serve as the chair of the Grantmakers for Education Board of Directors. And it is my job to introduce to you the plenary for this afternoon. But before I do that, there's a couple of announcements. I know many of you are aware that Celine, our fearless leader, Celine Coggins, announced her departure from her post by the end of this year. And so the board has been engaged in this process of searching for our new fearless leader. And we have retained the services of Isaacson Miller. In particular, Karen Avery is heading up that assignment to help us find a new leader. And the board has made it imperative that we engage the members, the GFE network membership, in engaging in this process, because our collective voice, our collective values and principles need to be reflected both in the process of finding our new leader as well as who that leader is, who's going to be coming on board. So please expect that in the coming weeks and months that we will be reaching out to you, gathering your insights, your thoughts, your feedback as to what this profile ought to look like, and the nature of that leader's representative capacity to bring our collective voice, not just to this stage, but to a larger audience. So Isaacson Miller will be tasked with providing you with the avenues to provide those to provide that engagement, either through virtual meetings, direct phone calls, interviews, even focus groups of subsets of our members to get that engagement. And at this point, I would love for you to reach out to members of the board of directors if you have any questions or any insights in terms of how we are doing this process. So if I can ask, Bright is so light, if I can ask members of the board to stand up so that the membership can see who you are and can reach out to you. So can I ask board members to take a stand? So please do reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. We would love to hear your thoughts on this very important step in the organization's next stage of growth. And I must say, I've been attending this conference for the past decade now, and this is only one of two conferences I go to every year. People are going to ask me what the other conference is. That's going to be confidential. But I always find this conference to be very insightful. I learn a lot and bring those lessons to the community that we serve and apply those great insights that you bring. So please continue to share those insights and best practices, because that's the platform that this conference is designed for. So now to our plenary, very exciting. I would love to claim a little bit of credit for bringing the conference to Austin. As some of you know, I used to live here in Austin, and I still do. My house is still here. My credit card bills are still sent over to that house. So I have a till death do us part relationship with Texas. But Celine and I did receive a few calls from members about why Texas. And my response to that is, why not Texas? Because it is a hotbed of a lot of issues, both at the policy and program levels. And if we cannot have these smart, deliberate conversations in a hotbed community, where can we have it? And amidst all of these polarizing policy discussions, there is brilliant work being done here. There is brilliant strategies from the grassroots level, from the foundation, from the funders' perspective, that we do need to put a magnifying lens and a spotlight on great work being done in a context of chaos and confusion. And if we cannot highlight those, we're not doing a great job as philanthropists. So I want to take credit. I want to credit, Communities Foundation of Texas, Powell Foundation, Trellis, George Foundation, the Andrew Roddick Foundation, and other foundations that are doing and providing those resources, very important resources here in Texas for communities to really do the work that needs to be done in order to provide the kind of opportunities young people need and our educators need in this polarizing context. And so our plenary session is really looking into how do we put light into these kinds of environments, into these kinds of polarizing situations, and create a coherent vision for us as funders, for us as members of our community. And so I'd love for you to really listen to a conversation and a presentation by Brian Stryker and Amanda Ripley. And this is something that I am very much looking forward to, so I will hand this over to Beverly Ross Denny, our Managing Director, who will lead a conversation with Brian Stryker.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the warm welcome. You may not recognize me without my glasses or my mask that I've worn for 2 days, but as Richard said, my name is Beverly Ross Denny, and I'm the Managing Director with Grantmakers for Education. I'm also an elected school board member and former deputy with the Boston Public Schools, which are just 2 reasons why our next speaker is so timely. Today, I have the honor to introduce you to Brian Stryker, who's a nationally renowned pollster and partner at Impact Research, where he's responsible for the Midwest region. He's polled on successful campaigns for Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Indiana Senator Joe Donnelly, and Michigan Congresswoman Haley Stevens, amongst his other accomplishments. Many of the topics that Brian will discuss today are issues that myself and my colleagues have wrestled with, and I look forward to hearing his insights with you. With that, I would like to introduce Brian.
Thank you. I have a quick slide presentation, and then we're going to kind of chat after that. So we're in election season, of course, and I want to talk a little bit about where we are in this election and how to make sense of it both in the next few weeks as the results coming in and then maybe a little bit after that. So here's where we're at. Democrats have extremely thin majorities in Congress. The Senate is tied. The House is a 5-seat Republican majority. Redistricting the every 10 years process has reduced that Democratic lean maybe by another couple seats. So Republicans don't need a huge win, they just need a little bit to take the House and the Senate. There are a few big factors at play. There's a tension between Joe Biden's job rating, which is low, and typically when a president's job rating is in this place, their party loses a lot of seats in a midterm election, frankly, even if they're in a better place than this. And that would have been the story, and that would have been a simple story, but then the Dobbs decision happens. And what you saw previously is Democrats were not energized, Republicans were energized. Dobbs happened, that changed all of that. Democrats are much more fired up, particularly women, particularly voters under 50, but Democrats across the board. So there's a real question of, will Democrats turn out and change history? What will the independents do who are very unhappy with the Dobbs decision and are very unhappy with Joe Biden and inflation and gas prices and all those sort of things that are bothering them? what we saw is Democrats make gains in the polls at that time, and we'll see if that holds up. The other big piece is candidate quality. The Republicans, because of the influence of Donald Trump, have gotten a lot of the candidates they did not prefer in some of these primaries. Pretty unpopular people in a lot of these places. Some of you are probably from Ohio, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, where their candidates are not, Republican candidates are not running strong campaigns and are not well liked. We'll see how much that matters, or how much people just go into the lever and pull the ticket because of their feelings about Joe Biden. The current assumption on 538, sort of, one of the main political sort of handicapping sites, thinks that Democrats probably retain the Senate and that Republicans probably win the House. But you can see with those percentages, those are not 100. They could both go one way or the other, or Democrats could retain the House and not the Senate. But the political ratings agencies, the people who study these elections sort of more on a sort of feel level than a data level, they think it's going to be a Republican sweep. So we'll see. Again, is this going to be history repeats itself, which is an unpopular president loses a ton of seats in a midterm election? Is it going to look like the polling, which is much more mixed? Or is it going to look like recent special elections? So when somebody retires or dies or is indicted or something like that in Congress, there's a special election to fill their seat. And they've all happened. All three of those things have happened and will continue to happen. In those cases, there's a special election to fill their seat, and Democrats have done way better than anyone expected in those. Will that translate till November? Who knows? But I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer of what to watch for. Actually, Indiana, I think, is one of the places I would keep my eyes on in early bellwethers. It's a state that the polls close early. They're pretty restrictive on voting in a lot of ways. And because of that, there's not a whole lot of early voting to speak of. They don't have a lot of mail-in ballots or that type of stuff. So there's a congressional seat in what's called the region, Northwest Indiana, sort of Gary area, Chicago suburbs. We got friends from the region. If Democrats lose that, it's going to be a sweep. Because that's a Democratic seat, not that Democratic, but Democratic. If Democrats win it convincingly, they might hold the House. Next will be Ohio and North Carolina. These might not happen exactly like this because we don't know how long votes are going to take to count and all that sort of stuff. But Ohio and North Carolina Senate races, if Democrats are winning those, they're going to have a great night. If Democrats are close, 2, 3, 4 points, they should have a pretty good night because there are a lot of other seats to come that are better for Democrats. What's going to decide the Senate is those 3 seats. If you win 2 out of 3 of those, you've basically won the Senate. They are in order right there from most likely to go to Democrats or Republicans, most likely to flip, or Nevada being the toughest, Pennsylvania being the most likely, but all of them could go either way. They're on a razor's edge, which is why control of the Senate is so contested. We have the problem for a lot of you that remember in Georgia, not the problem, the design of the elections, that if nobody gets 50%, they do a runoff election, they do it all over again. The 2 parties are going to spend $1 billion fighting each other and changing nobody's mind. It's going to be painful. But that'll happen a month after the election, and that could decide control of the Senate too, which will be its own wildness. And then there's some big, close governor's races. A lot of them are in the Midwest, just by the nature of the Midwest. Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all Democratic incumbents in states that aren't that Democratic. Those will be up for grabs. A few races in the West, including in Arizona, or in Oregon, where there's a third-party candidate that could impact things. A lot of governor's races up for grabs. There's 38 up for election total. Almost all governor's elections happen in the midterm. So those would be the things I would watch for on election night. And then the question is, do people like me have any idea what we're talking about, right? In 2016 and 2020, the answer was, well, not so much, right? We didn't look so good. I would say that right now, public polls, the people that you've heard of, the Pews, the Gallups, those sort of name brands out there, are a little more optimistic for Democrats than internal pollsters. In part, that's because campaign pollsters adjusted, particularly Democratic campaign pollsters who got embarrassed in 2020, adjusted what they're doing, tried to get it more accurate. We'll see what happens. A lot of the pivotal states are the places where you've seen the polling error, the Michigans, the Pennsylvanias, the Wisconsins, the places where Democrats said, surely we're good, look at these polls, and then not so much. So that's going to be another piece of it that I'll be particularly nervous about in 3 weeks. So we'll see. But yeah, that's the 5-minute talk of what I see coming in the next 3 weeks here, and then we'll kind of talk about where we go from there.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
So, as Brian forecasted for you, we have a fireside chat, and I have several questions based on what we've seen in the popular press and some research that Impact Research has performed. So, during the last local election cycle, we saw something we don't normally see. National parties preparing candidates to run for local office, such as school boards. Traditionally, these candidates run on local issues and don't share their party affiliation during their campaigns. I'd like to know how both parties, Democrats and Republicans, tried to use education as a political strategy to secure their power. And I also want to know if it worked.
So I think Republicans were more savvy about this on the start and more coordinated and organized about it. And I think they took, in particular, the issue of critical race theory, right, that was not a term that the American public had any familiarity with until Republicans told them that they should. And they were able to drive some energy around that. Now, they weren't actually that successful in school board races, and they weren't actually successful in changing a lot of people's minds and making them vote on this issue. The thing it helped them do is if you look at the Virginia governor's election or the New Jersey governor's election, it did help motivate some of their base and get them fired up, and people that might not have turned out in a non-presidential election to show up. But when you look at Ohio and Wisconsin, which actually had school board elections on that exact same day, nothing really changed. Those candidates that ran on CRT didn't win. We'll talk about sort of why a little bit later, but I think that it's the sort of thing where kind of everything is getting partisanized these days, like what brands you buy or what sports you watch, or like everything just is partisan. Certainly what news you consume, which cable channel you watch. If you watch Fox or MSNBC, you're 90% in one party or the other. So I think it is yet another extension of everything at the ballot, everything just being partisanized, and you even see it on school board referendums now, where they just become these partisan, on school bonds, right? It used to be just, yeah, sure, we approve the school bond, and then we get a new gym or whatever the thing was, right? And now it's much more of a fight. So, and I do think the trend is always in the direction, at least right now, of more partisanship. So I would expect that trend to continue, and frankly, Democrats to get in the game a little bit.
My second question is around parent rights. We're getting a lot of messages about parent rights, you see my air quotes, in K-12 education. And last November, we saw Glenn Youngkin ride the wave of parent rights into the governor's mansion of Virginia. From your research, what do parents say they really want from schools?
Yeah, and I think that was a bigger part of the 2021 election than the critical race theory piece, and a lot of it was around COVID policy. Parents were tired. Their kids hadn't been in school for a year. They didn't know if they were coming back the next year, and I think a lot of us have seen the effect of that on learning, and parents saw it, right? When you ask parents in polls, last year in particular, did your kids lose ground during the pandemic and their learning? 2/3 said yes. And so that was a big frustration, and I think that, and the fact that they had their kids at home and were seeing everything they were learning, right? Or not learning, right? Yeah, exactly. Was another thing that really drove parents to be upset. Less so the social policy stuff. I mean, the thing is, it's again like one of these things. The idea of parents being involved in their kids' education was not a controversial thing 2 years ago. I mean, of course, we all want our parents to be involved in kids' education. But then it has turned into this partisan thing of this is the parent rights we mean when we say it in politics. That's not actually what parents want. Like, they want to know what their kids are learning. They want to make sure somebody's addressing individual needs of their kids, right? They're sort of excelling in this, or they're slower in this, or something else. They want that engagement. They don't really care about the social policy stuff as much. They just want to make sure their kids in an environment where they're learning and supportive. So I do think that's a place where, on the long term, Republicans will probably have overreached, and I don't think parents think parent rights are what they think it is.
Well, that's a great segue into my next question, because we're trying to figure out whether or not this is something that's long-lasting. But can you talk to us about what you're seeing now in local elections? Where does education stand relative on the scales of all the other issues we're seeing in the news in terms of issues people are worried about?
Yeah, it's hard. The other thing, not only our politics have become more partisanized, but they've become more federal. So you'll get a candidate for city council answering a question on the right to choose, or on what's going on in Ukraine, or something like that. Everything has just become more driven by the federal. And you used to see people vote one way, Democrat in their local community, Republican, and then national, or whatever. And that's really going away. So I think education has dropped down the list in terms of priorities because gas prices are such a big deal to people, and the cost of living, right? Gas prices is the most obvious one, but the high cost of housing, which we were talking about, all these things that are really pinching people's wallets and make it hard for them to focus on something else. And then Dobbs comes along, and then that's the thing that really draws focus, particularly for Democrats, but for pro-choice voters of all stripes, right? People feel like their rights are under attack, and that's again a hard thing to focus on something else politically when something so dominant is going on in the conversation. So it has dropped down the list in terms of, if you ask people to pick from a list of issues, it's not number 1, it's not number 2, it's probably number 5, something like that. But at the same time, people really care about schools. I mean, it is a big deal to them, and especially with how they feel about the way education has gone over the last 2, and because of the pandemic, the disruptions. Getting kids back on track is really, really important to voters. And I think you're going to see in 23 and 24, after we have this election, hopefully the economy sort of normalizes a little bit. Parents are going to, and voters are going to start to turn their focus to a lot more.
Well, looking at some of your recent research launched in collaboration with the Wall Street Journal, it looks like inflation is still a significant issue going into the November elections. The poll also highlights that inflation takes the greatest toll on non-white voters. Mm-hmm. Do you have any other insights from your research that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, there's no question that voters of color, voters without a college degree, which are 2 overlapping groups, right? Of course, there are white people without a college degree and people of color with a college degree, but disproportionately, voters of color are lower income in this country. They've been hit harder in terms of wages during the pandemic, not going up, right? They probably took more disruptions because they did a service industry job, or they did a job that requires you to be in person, right? A job that you can't do over Zoom. And so anyone down the income scale is really feeling the pinch, right? Because the difference for somebody making $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year and the gas prices go up, it's annoying, right? And you might sort of struggle when you're buying a house, but when your rent goes up 20% and you're paying $5 a gallon and you're making $25,000, $30,000 a year, that is an existential threat, right? That is existential. So it is a really big issue for voters of color. I think there are a few other things I would say are really important for voters of color right now. One is Dobbs, right? And I think that one thing that we see from voters of color in all of our research is when people start taking away rights, like they're on the list. Yep, exactly. Like when we're starting to go after people's fundamental rights, voting rights are not far behind. A whole bunch of other rights are not far behind, and of course those are up debate now in a way they weren't 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because of reversal of the Voting Rights Act. So those economic issues are very important for voters of color, in part because they're just less likely to have a college degree, and they're lower down on the income scale than your average white voter, just on the median.
And that's especially important to our funders, because in our most recent research around what our focus areas are going to be in our strategic plan, it is around equity and ensuring that people do have access to equitable educational systems, and it's going to be much harder to do under these circumstances. We only have a few minutes left, but I have one more question. So as we close out on our time together, what words of advice do you have for our funders on how they should approach their work in light of what you've learned?
So I think two things in terms of what is on voters' minds about education really stand out to me. Doesn't mean they're right? Like, doesn't mean that they've studied the facts and they know exactly what's going to help improve educational outcomes. But two things that they're thinking of that are really important. One is they feel like their kids have slipped behind because of the pandemic, and they want help getting their kids back on track. And that may be individualized tutoring. That may be school-wide programs. That may be a change in the way that we rethink about assessments, right? And sort of being able to use them to help your kid and being more specific to your kid, helping them figure out, because the parents have a sense, they don't know that their kid has lost 3/4 of a grade level in reading or whatever, but they do know that their kid was there for a year and a half and they sure weren't learning as much as they were before. So anything that is helping parents feel like their kids are getting back on track to where they were, that's really important. The other piece I would say is that most parents want their kid to go to college, right? Most parents think that's a really good path for a kid, and they don't reject that. But they do want to make sure that for the majority of America that is not going to college, that there is a path for them, that there is something for them, right? That it is not you go to college or you figure it out, right? And whether that looks like community college, whether that looks like trade classes in school, whether that looks like more practical learning. One of the best things we poll is computers in science labs in schools, right? And some of those are giving kids coding skills or whatever else that technical skills that might not mean they're going to be a professor of computer science, but can mean they can get a stable job and support a family in that. So those are two things that are really on voters' minds as far as what they want to see.
And is there anything unique to marginalized populations?
Actually, those are with more intensity among marginalized populations because, one, if you are in a really wealthy suburb, college for all mostly seems fine to you, right? Like that is, most kids are going to go to college. And then two, I think we saw some of the, whatever you put to the statistics, the parents in communities where kids had less access to high-speed internet, the school district might not have had the resource to have the individualized conversations on Zoom and stuff that, even if it didn't solve the problems of education during the pandemic, mitigated it. They might not have had the technology at all, right? And I would actually put city districts, lower income city districts, and rural districts in those exact same buckets. Very easy to forget about. That problem is the same across those two districts. So those are even more important to communities of color.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, and please join me in a round of applause for Brian.
Thanks, it was great being here. Appreciate it. Thank you, too. It was great.
At this time, I would like to introduce to you Amanda Ripley. Amanda is an award-winning journalist. You probably know her from her book, Smartest Kids in the World. She's here to speak with us today about her newest book titled High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. Please join me in welcoming Amanda. So we ended a few minutes early, which gives me an opportunity to share with you what we have planned for this afternoon. So starting at 5:45 today, we will have a series of receptions in the session rooms that surround this area. and I invite you to come and visit as many as you can. And it was nice seeing you all. I hope you're enjoying the conference, and I look forward to seeing you later on today. Thank you.